Imagine two continents, two versions of Christianity, two completely different futures. In America, church pews that once overflowed now sit mostly empty. Denominations that shaped this nation for centuries are closing thousands of churches every year. Young people are walking away in record numbers. Christianity, as Americans have known it, appears to be dying. But 7,000 miles away, something extraordinary is happening. In Africa, Christianity isn't just surviving, it's exploding. Churches are being built faster than they can be counted. Millions are converting. The faith is spreading with an energy and passion that America hasn't seen in generations. By 2050, 4 out of every 10 Christians in the world will live in sub-Saharan Africa. Think about that. The future center of Christianity won't be Rome, or London, or Nashville. It will be Lagos, Nairobi, and Kinshasa. So today, we're diving deep into one of the most dramatic religious shifts in human history. We're going to explore why Christianity is booming in one place while fading in another. We'll look at the numbers, the reasons, the culture, and what this means for the future of faith on a global scale. This isn't just a story about religion. It's a story about culture, identity, colonialism, economics, and hope. Whether you're a believer or not, this shift will reshape the world you live in. So let's begin with the numbers, because they tell a stunning story. In 1900, there were fewer than 10 million Christians in all of Africa. Today, there are over 730 million. That's not a typo. Africa went from having almost no Christian presence to being home to more Christians than any other continent on Earth. Christianity in Africa is growing at a rate of about 2.6% per year. To put that in perspective, that means Africa is adding roughly 19 million new Christians every single year. That's more than the entire population of New York State, every year. By 2025, Africa is expected to have 760 million Christians. By 2050, projections suggest there could be over 1 billion Christians in Africa. At that point, Africa will have more Christians than Asia and Latin America combined. Let me give you some specific countries to make this real. Nigeria has 74 million Christians. Ethiopia has 77 million. The Democratic Republic of Congo has over 60 million. Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and South Africa each have tens of millions of Christians. In countries like Zambia, 96% of the population identifies as Christian. In Rwanda, it's 94%. In Seychelles, 95%. These aren't just Christian-majority nations, they're overwhelmingly Christian. And here's what's remarkable. Most of this growth is happening through conversion, not just birth rates. People are choosing Christianity. Churches are evangelizing. Faith is spreading organically through communities, families, and networks. Meanwhile, in America, the story couldn't be more different. In 2007, 78% of Americans identified as Christian. By 2024, that number had fallen to about 62%. That's a drop of 16 percentage points in less than 2 decades. Church attendance has plummeted. In the year 2000, 42% of Americans attended religious services weekly or nearly weekly. Today, that figure is just 30%. And among young people, it's even lower. 17% of Americans now say they never attend religious services, up from 11% just a decade ago. The number of Americans who identify as religious knowns, people with no religious affiliation, has grown from 16% in 2007 to over 30% today. And here's the part that should concern Christian leaders. For every 1 person who converts to Christianity in America, 6 people leave. That's not a sustainable ratio. That's a faith in freefall. Thousands of churches are closing every year. As we've discussed in other videos, small-town churches especially are disappearing at alarming rates. The congregations that remain are older, smaller, and struggling financially. So what we're witnessing is a complete geographical shift in global Christianity. In 1900, 95% of the world's Christians lived in Europe and North America. By 2025, 69% of Christians live in the Global South, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. By 2050, that figure is projected to reach 78%. The center of Christianity has moved. The question is, why? Let's start with Africa, because understanding why Christianity is growing there helps us understand why it's struggling in America. The first reason is simple but profound. Christianity in Africa offers hope in the midst of hardship. Many African nations face enormous challenges: poverty, political instability, disease, lack of infrastructure, corruption. Life for millions of people is genuinely difficult in ways that most Americans can't fully comprehend. And into that context, Christianity arrives with a message that resonates deeply. God loves you. You have value. Your suffering is not meaningless. There is hope for a better future, both in this life and the next. Churches in Africa don't just preach. They act. They run schools where government schools don't exist. They operate clinics and hospitals in areas with no other healthcare. They provide food, water, emergency relief, and social support. In many places, the church is the only reliable institution people can turn to. This is Christianity functioning the way it did in its earliest centuries, as a grassroots movement meeting people's real needs, not as an established cultural institution maintaining traditions. The second major reason is the power of Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity. The fastest-growing forms of Christianity in Africa aren't traditional mainline denominations. They're Pentecostal and charismatic churches that emphasize the Holy Spirit, healing, miracles, speaking in tongues, and personal transformation. These churches offer something deeply attractive: the promise of direct, experiential encounter with God. Not just doctrine, not just ritual, but actual spiritual power that can change your life right now. In cultures where spiritual forces, ancestors, spirits, traditional deities have always been seen as real and active, a Christianity that acknowledges spiritual warfare and offers spiritual power makes intuitive sense. It doesn't ask people to stop believing in the spiritual realm. It offers a more powerful spiritual solution. This is also Christianity that's culturally African, not culturally European. African churches incorporate drums, dance, emotional expression, and extended worship in ways that feel natural to African culture. The faith isn't being imported in Western packaging anymore. It's being expressed in African voices, African music, African leadership. The third factor is demographics and birth rates. Africa has the youngest population of any continent, with a median age of just 19 years old. Young people are the future of any movement, and African Christianity has millions of young, energetic, passionate believers. Africa also has high birth rates. Christian families in Africa tend to have more children than secular families in the West, which means the Christian population naturally grows through births as well as conversions. But it's not just about numbers. It's about energy. Young Christians are starting churches, launching ministries, evangelizing their communities, using social media to spread the faith. There's a vibrancy and momentum that's self-sustaining. The fourth reason is that Christianity in Africa hasn't been deeply wounded by scandals and hypocrisy the way it has in the West. To be clear, African Christianity isn't perfect. There are problems with prosperity gospel abuse, with pastors exploiting congregants, with lack of theological depth in some movements. But the faith itself hasn't been tainted by centuries of colonialism, crusades, inquisitions, witch trials, and the close association with oppressive political power in the way Western Christianity has been. African Christians can embrace the faith without carrying the same historical baggage that burdens Christians in Europe and America. The fifth factor is the role of education and literacy. In African churches, worship is physical, emotional, and extended. Services can last 3 or 4 hours. People dance, shout, weep, and express themselves freely. There's no assumption that worship should be quiet, orderly, or intellectually focused. Literacy and Christianity have grown together. creating a virtuous cycle where educated Africans often become church leaders, teachers, and evangelists. So when you put all these factors together, real help in hard times, experiential spirituality, cultural authenticity, young demographics, historical timing, and educational opportunity, you get explosive growth. Now let's turn to America and ask the harder question. Why is Christianity dying here? The first and most obvious reason is that America is wealthy, comfortable, and secure. When life is relatively easy, when you have food, shelter, healthcare, entertainment, and opportunity, the existential questions that religion addresses become less urgent. You don't desperately need God to rescue you from poverty, disease, or oppression when you're living in a comfortable suburban home with good healthcare and a stable job. In Africa, people pray for daily bread because they genuinely don't know where their next meal is coming from. In America, people pray for parking spaces at the mall. The stakes feel different. The need feels less acute. This doesn't mean Americans don't have real problems: mental health, addiction, loneliness, anxiety. But those problems don't automatically drive people toward religion the way survival level needs do. The second reason is the association between American Christianity and political power. Over the past few decades, Christianity in America has become increasingly intertwined with conservative politics. Churches have become partisan spaces. Pastors preach about elections as much as salvation. The faith has been weaponized in culture wars. For millions of Americans, especially younger generations, Christianity now represents not the teachings of Jesus but the politics of the religious right. When they reject those politics, they reject the faith entirely. This is particularly true around issues like LGBTQ+ rights, where many young people see the church as judgmental and exclusionary. Around issues of racial justice, where many see white evangelical churches as complicit in racism. Around issues of gender equality, where many see churches as patriarchal and oppressive. The third reason is the failure of American churches to address real doubts and hard questions. American Christianity, particularly in evangelical spaces, often demands certainty. It insists on biblical inerrancy, on absolute truth claims, on rejecting doubt. But we live in an age of information, where people have access to scholarship, science, comparative religion, and diverse perspectives. When churches tell educated, curious people that they can't ask hard questions, that doubt is sin, that they must choose between science and faith, many people choose to leave. They find the intellectual environment suffocating. African Christianity, ironically, often allows more space for mystery, for supernatural experience that doesn't need rational explanation, for a both-and approach rather than either-or thinking. The fourth major factor is the collapse of community. American life has become increasingly individualistic, isolated, and digital. People don't know their neighbors. Extended families live scattered across the country. Social life happens online rather than in person. Churches used to be one of the primary places Americans built community. But as other forms of connection have weakened, churches haven't successfully filled that gap. In fact, many churches mirror the same problems: superficial relationships, consumeristic mindset, lack of genuine belonging. In Africa, by contrast, community is still strong. Extended families live together. Neighbors know each other. Church isn't just a Sunday service. It's a network of relationships that structure daily life. The fifth reason is generational trauma and church hurt. Millions of Americans have been wounded by churches. They've experienced spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, financial manipulation, judgmentalism, hypocrisy, and rejection. These aren't theoretical problems. They're lived experiences that create deep pain. When the institution that's supposed to represent God's love becomes a source of harm, people walk away. And they don't come back easily. The sixth factor is secularization and competing worldviews. In America, people have many options for meaning, purpose, and community outside of religion. You can find meaning through career, activism, hobbies, online communities, therapy, or personal spirituality without organized religion. In Africa, Christianity doesn't face the same level of competition from secular alternatives. The infrastructure of secular meaning-making, universities, therapy culture, self-help movements, online communities, isn't as developed. So when you combine American wealth, political weaponization, intellectual rigidity, community collapse, institutional harm, and secular alternatives, you get decline. But here's what's fascinating. It's not just that Africa is different from America. African Christianity is actually different from American Christianity in fundamental ways. Let me give you some specific examples. In African churches, worship is physical, emotional, and extended. Services can last 3 or 4 hours. People dance, shout, weep, and express themselves freely. There's no assumption that worship should be quiet, orderly, or intellectually focused. In American churches, especially mainline Protestant and Catholic churches, worship is often subdued, formal, and brief. Even in evangelical churches, there's a performance quality, professional music, polished preaching, efficient timing. African Christianity tends to emphasize spiritual warfare, demons, healing, and miracles. These aren't fringe beliefs, they're central to the faith for millions. Prayer isn't just meditation, the spiritual battle. American Christianity, especially outside Pentecostal circles, has largely naturalized or psychologized these elements. We explain things through psychology, medicine, and natural causes rather than spiritual forces. African Christianity is deeply communal. Your faith isn't just personal. It's family faith, community faith, tribal faith. Conversion often happens in groups. Worship happens in community. Accountability is collective. American Christianity is intensely individual. It's about your personal relationship with Jesus, your personal salvation, your personal spiritual journey. Even when Americans worship in groups, the focus remains individual. African Christianity emphasizes transformation in this life. People come to church expecting tangible change, healing, provision, breakthrough, freedom from spiritual bondage. American Christianity, particularly mainline Protestantism, has often emphasized afterlife salvation while being uncomfortable with promises of earthly transformation. The prosperity gospel is controversial precisely because it promises too much in this life. African Christianity is led by Africans. The pastors are African, the worship is African, the theology is being developed by African scholars for African contexts. American Christianity still largely operates with European and American theological frameworks, worship styles, and leadership models developed centuries ago in completely different contexts. So in many ways, African Christianity looks less like European Christianity transplanted to new soil and more like Christianity returning to something closer to its earliest expressions: grassroots, experiential, communal, expectant of God's active presence. Now, what does all this mean for the future? First, the global face of Christianity is changing. If you think of Christianity as white, Western, and middle class, you're thinking of the past, not the future. The typical Christian in 2050 will be African, poor, Pentecostal, and female. This will reshape theology, worship, church structures, and Christian engagement with social issues. African concerns, poverty, health, governance, economic development, will become the central concerns of global Christianity. Second, African Christianity will increasingly influence American Christianity rather than the reverse. Already, African missionaries are being sent to plant churches in America and Europe, reversing the historic flow of missions. African theological voices are gaining prominence. African worship music is spreading globally. African church models are being studied and replicated. Third, this shift may force American Christianity to reckon with its own failures and compromises. When American churches see the vitality of African faith, it raises uncomfortable questions. What have we lost? What have we traded for comfort and respectability? Have we turned the radical message of Jesus into a civil religion that serves our interests? Fourth, the diversity within global Christianity will likely increase tensions. African Christianity tends to be theologically conservative on issues like sexuality and gender. As African churches gain influence in denominations, conflicts over these issues will intensify. But this isn't necessarily bad. Healthy tensions can force growth, conversation, and deeper understanding. Fifth, we may see Christianity increasingly become a religion of the poor and marginalized worldwide, while secular worldviews dominate among the educated and wealthy. This would actually align Christianity more closely with its origins as a movement among slaves, women, the poor, and the powerless. Let me be clear about something important. This isn't a story of African Christianity being better or American Christianity being worse. Both have strengths and weaknesses. African Christianity's emphasis on spiritual power and miraculous intervention can sometimes lead to exploitation, false promises, and magical thinking. The prosperity gospel has done real damage in Africa, creating unrealistic expectations and enriching charismatic leaders at the expense of poor followers. American Christianity's intellectual tradition, social justice advocacy, and sophisticated theology have tremendous value. The American church has produced brilliant scholars, remarkable institutions, and prophetic voices for justice. The point isn't to romanticize Africa or condemn America. The point is to understand that Christianity takes different forms in different contexts, and those forms are profoundly shaped by culture, economics, history, and social conditions. What works in Lagos won't necessarily work in Los Angeles. What resonates in rural Kenya might not resonate in suburban Dallas. And that's okay. That's how Christianity has always spread, adapting to new contexts while maintaining core beliefs. But here's what American Christianity can learn from African Christianity. First, people need more than intellectual arguments. They need experiential faith, genuine community, and hope that speaks to their real struggles. Second, Christianity doesn't have to choose between supernatural faith and engagement with the world. African churches demonstrate that you can believe in miracles and still provide practical help, education, and social services. Third, worship doesn't have to be polite, brief, or culturally Western to be authentic. There are 1,000 ways to express devotion. Fourth, Christianity grows when it meets real needs and offers genuine hope, not when it functions primarily as a cultural marker or political identity. Fifth, young people are drawn to movements with energy, purpose, and expectation that God is actually doing something now, not just preparing believers for heaven later. And here's what African Christianity might learn from American Christianity. First, theological depth matters. Charismatic experience is powerful, but without solid teaching, it can lead people astray. Second, beware of tying Christianity too closely to political power or cultural identity. That's a trap that has weakened the church everywhere it's been tried. Third, accountability, financial transparency, and protecting the vulnerable from exploitation must be central, not peripheral, to church life. Fourth, intellectual honesty strengthens faith. It doesn't threaten it. Christians should be able to engage science, scholarship, and difficult questions without fear. Fifth, Christianity must be willing to evolve on issues of justice, inclusion, and human dignity. The church has been wrong before and will be wrong again. Humility is essential. Here's the bottom line. Christianity is exploding in Africa because it offers something people desperately need and want: hope, community, spiritual power, practical help, cultural authenticity, and a vision for transformation. Christianity is declining in America because it has become associated with hypocrisy, political power, intellectual rigidity, cultural irrelevance, and institutional failure. It no longer meets needs that aren't being met elsewhere. It no longer offers a compelling vision that draws people in. But this isn't necessarily permanent. Cultural trends can shift. Revivals can happen. Institutions can reform. If American Christianity is willing to learn, to change, to listen, to serve rather than dominate, renewal is possible. And African Christianity, as it grows in influence and confidence, will face its own tests. Will it resist the temptations of wealth and power? Will it develop the theological depth to sustain its growth? Will it remain true to the gospel or be co-opted by the same forces that weakened Western Christianity? These are the questions that will shape the future of global Christianity. One thing is certain: the story of Christianity in the 21st century will be written primarily by people who are not white, not Western, and not wealthy. The faith that began in the Middle East, spread through Africa and Europe, and dominated the West for centuries is returning to its global, multicultural, multi-ethnic origins. And that's not a loss. That's a return to what Christianity was always meant to be: a faith for all people, in all places, offering hope to anyone who seeks it. The explosive growth in Africa isn't just about numbers. It's about the future. It's about what happens when faith meets genuine need. It's about what Christianity looks like when it's not propped up by cultural privilege or political power, but grows organically because people find it meaningful, true, and transformative. And the decline in America isn't just about statistics. It's a warning. It's what happens when institutions become self-serving, when faith becomes cultural performance, when the radical message of Jesus gets domesticated into respectability. The question for American Christians isn't whether they can make Christianity look like it did in 1950. That world is gone. The question is whether they can learn from their brothers and sisters in Africa, Latin America, and Asia who are demonstrating that the gospel still has power, still transforms lives, still builds communities, and still offers hope. The geography of Christianity has changed. The question now is whether the heart of Christianity can be renewed. If this video helped you understand this massive global shift, share it with someone who needs to see it. Whether you're Christian, curious, or completely secular, this trend matters because it will shape the world we all live in. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.